There's an educational gap. There's a cultural gap. We have people in our congregation. We have some people in our congregation who are medical doctors, who are highly trained professionals, who would love to hear or could at least follow abstract, rational type preaching. But then we have people in our church who haven't read a book for 20 years. They're unfamiliar with the Bible. They maybe made it through high school, but barely. They've not done any post-high school education. They haven't been in a classroom for 30 years. So now I'm supposed to stand up and preach and communicate across the gamut. And plus we've got kids in the room, old people in the room, people hearing their 1,000th sermon, people hearing their second sermon in their life. Storytelling, I've come to realize, and other people have helped me realize, transcends all these boundaries. When I tell a story like about the couple you mentioned, everybody in the room is engaged and listening and interested in hearing about this couple. If I just speak abstractly and define forgiveness and therefore this and therefore that, if I make more than one logical inference because of this, therefore that, and then if I make a second and therefore this, I've lost half the room. I've gone too abstract, too theoretical. That's good academic writing. It's terrible preaching in my context with my people. So better to do what's a little bit harder for me, at least, do the hard work of figuring out some kind of story I can tell that will make that point, rather than just lecturing through that point and watching the room disengage as I do. That's part of what coming to realize about the value of those stories.
Hi, welcome to the Expositors Collective Podcast, episode 219. I'm your host, Mike Neglia, and our guest this week is Dr. Adam Copenhaver. In this conversation, we speak about, amongst other things, we speak about the right and the wrong ways to include personal stories in the middle of our Bible teaching and preaching. Here's the reality. Listen, we all know that there's a wrong way to tell stories about ourselves in the midst of our sermons, right? You've heard them, the type where there's the self-aggrandizing preacher who is the hero of every story that he tells. Well, Dr. Copenhaver believes that there's actually ways that we can tell stories from our lives and our experience that actually refresh our listeners, that open their minds to think differently and further cement biblical truth and really show that Jesus is the hero, not the preacher, not anyone else, but Christ alone. This conversation was a joy to have. We discuss a book that Dr. Copenhaver has recently co-published with Dr. Jeffrey Arthurs. It's a commentary on Colossians and Philemon. Make sure that you're subscribed to this show, because in future episodes, I get to speak to Dr. Jeffrey Arthur as well. And we're going to be doing a giveaway of this wonderful Colossians commentary in the next couple of weeks. Just want to throw that out there to say that there's more coming. There's more coming. Okay, hope you enjoy this conversation, and I'll catch you again at the end. Hey, welcome to the Expositors Collective Podcast. I'm excited to be speaking with Adam Copenhaver. And, Adam, I'm just going to dive straight into it. The first question that we always ask is, can you let us know about the first time you ever taught the Bible in public or preached? As kind of a way for us to get to know you a bit.
Yeah, sure. My first time, probably like a lot of people, my first time preaching was an absolute train wreck. My church that I kind of grew up in and was discipled in had a program for high schoolers where you could do some different ministry things. And one of them was preaching. And for some reason, as a freshman in high school, maybe 13 years old, I thought I'll try that. And so my pastor kind of gave me a little bit of guidance, and I worked really hard for a few weeks to put together a 10-minute sermon. I practiced it probably 100 times. And when I got up to deliver it to my youth group, within about 30 seconds, this is teenage angst here, my voice started cracking.
No.
And I could not get out a clear sentence. And it was very awkward, very uncomfortable. And I think I was done within about 90 seconds. I just wrapped it up and sat down. And there was kind of an awkward silence in the room, like, that was it. And that was it. that was my first attempt.
Seriously, what happened? What happened next?
Well, the youth leaders took over our youth meeting, and we finished out the night. And then over the next few years in high school, I kept with that program though, and kept kind of being mentored and trying to preach a little bit here and there. And so by the time I was graduating high school, I was pretty usually like 10 or 15-minute sermons like that, sometimes Sunday morning in the service, kind of a little mini sermon before the pastor gave his sermon, or different youth events and things.
So when your voice cracked and you sat down, but I mean, like, what actually happened next? Did they grab the acoustic guitar, and what did they do with those other 9.5 minutes?
Probably something like that. It was a pretty informal youth group, but
sure.
I'm sure they scrambled to try to take the spotlight off of me.
Yeah.
In my awkwardness, all my peers sitting around, my buddies still, hey, good job, lied and tried to affirm me and make me feel a little better about it.
Well, for some people, that could be the first and the last time they ever attempted to do that. Like I can imagine when you're 13, you're so kind of vulnerable and not even sure of yourself. Like, I guess, what was it that after you sat down to think like, well, I'll try again next time, instead of, well, I quit?
Probably just that encouragement. And I was very fortunate at that time. I had a pastor who was kind of a mentor to me and had been for a few years, and a great encourager. And so he, I don't think he was there at that youth meeting when I did that, but maybe if he had been, he would have stopped encouraging me. But he kept, giving me opportunities. Hey, let's do this again. What's your next one going to be? And just kind of on we went from there. So very gracious and affirming.
Yeah.
In that church.
Well, okay. Well, I mean, obviously flowing into the next question. So that's your kind of unlikely origin story. And since then, I know that you've pastored in multiple locations. Not only are you a regular preacher, you've actually, as I mentioned in the introduction, you have, written like commentaries to help other preachers. So how have you like grown as a preacher since then? What are the kind of markings in your growth as a preacher since then?
Yeah, well, growing up was part of it, just
sure.
Maturing. But went to Bible college and seminary, and along the way has some involvement with other churches, some internships and things. And so just gaining more experience, learning how to preach a little better, communicate better. And then probably really what was really formative from a preaching perspective was straight out of seminary. When I was about 23 or 24 years old, I became the solo pastor of a small church for about 3 or 4 years. And that just kind of threw me into the deep end of just weekly preaching and trying to figure it out. And there were a lot of bad sermons there too, where halfway through preaching, I'm realizing nobody is connecting with this. I'm just completely missing the mark, and going back to the drawing board. What am I supposed to be doing here? And so that was really where I really cut my teeth, I think, and tried to really figure out what this looks like the week in and week out for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. I was a solo pastor at 23 as well. It is way too young. It is way too young. Now I'm 39, and so I have a lot more experience than most people my age. And so that's a good thing. I'm thankful for that, but it is it was a strange set of circumstances that brought me into it. Maybe you too. And, to kind of be learning in public, and to be, making mistakes and figuring things out. Again, we mentioned 13 is a young age. 23 sort of is as well too. So
yeah,
congratulations. I'm glad you survived. I'm glad you made it.
Well, barely. But I had a very gracious congregation, mostly older people, and they were so proud to have a young pastor, and very, very gracious to me and very affirming. This maybe isn't what you want to talk about here, but it was also rough in its own way. I had a young marriage, young family, a lot of stress. And so after a few years, that's when I decided, maybe I'll go back to school, take the stress down a notch and enter a PhD program, which is how I came to do that and take a few years break. And really the PhD program was much less stressful than pastoring a church as a solo pastor as a young man like that, and was good for my marriage, good for my family, good for me to do that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Boy, that took a turn. I'm happy to hear that you made it. And I've wisely decided to go back to school, but remain in ministry. So I'm working on my master's right now. So it's just adding more to it. But I think I'm not solo pastoring anymore. I'm part of a team. The church is at a healthy stage now. So it's unsustainable. And each of us have in different ways made it sustainable by making these various choices. So
and those some of the lessons you learn alongside the preaching lessons are how to manage ministry on the whole and how to do it in what Lord willing is a healthy, sustainable way, not just for ourselves as the pastor, but also our families and the people around us. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And I definitely hit the ground like it was a sprint. And had to learn the hard way that it's a marathon.
Yeah, absolutely. And, allow me to just kind of plug here, kind of our sister podcast. We're the Expositors Collective. I maybe recommend the Leadership Collective, which our friends Ted and Rob do, talking about kind of the other aspects of pastoral ministry, building that support network, having a healthy board and team ministry and that kind of thing. So if you're not listening to Leadership Collective, I suggest that you do. If you're 23 years old and if you think it's all about preaching, boy, are you in for a treat, because it's more than just preaching. It's a whole lot of other stuff too.
Yes, a lot of hats to wear.
Absolutely. Okay, so in these various locations that you've been in and congregations who you've looked after, I know what's important to you is the importance of kind of like knowing the people to whom you are speaking. It seems that preaching to you is more than just explaining what the text means, but it's kind of an act of pastoring a group of people. Do you want to kind of help us understand that?
Yeah. For me, preaching is, as I've developed, I suppose, I've come to value preaching and think of it more as a pastoral role. So it's pastoral preaching as opposed to public preaching. And what I mean by that is when I first started preaching, and then even when I first started in the church I'm currently in, and the people sitting in front of me are strangers, I'm preaching more of an abstract kind of message, like to the generic person who might be out there somewhere. Mm-hmm. And that's very different than preaching to a congregation I know, where these are people that I've invested my life in, and I've spent time among them, and I know where their hurts are, and I know what they're rejoicing in. I know what's burdening them. And now I'm crafting my message to them or for them. And so the more that I've been in my church currently for 10 years, a church of about 80 people in a small town, and the more I get to know this congregation, the less inclined I am to want to put my sermons online for an invisible audience. And the more they are just for this group in this place and this time. And they may or may not have universal value, and that's not really what it's for. It's for these people here and now.
But your sermons are online. I know, because I've listened to some of them.
Yes. So, and the reason we put them online is for the congregation. If you missed a week and you want to hear the sermon that you've missed and keep up with the series or whatever we're doing, that's why they're online, is for our own congregation. And then I know, other people can access them, which is fine. But that's not our purpose in putting them online. It's a secondary thing.
Yeah. So in preach, it's not as if the congregation is the live studio audience, but you're preaching past them for the universal, downloaders out there. Yeah,
exactly. And another way to look at it or approach it is, I'll sometimes ask, why would anybody come to my church to hear me preach when they could sit at home and log, get on YouTube or wherever and find their favorite preacher out there, John Piper or whoever it is that they like, Andy Stanley, somebody on TV. Why would they come hear me preach when I'm not half the preacher those guys are? And the reality is because they know me. It's the relationship. They know me, I know them, and nobody else out there is writing a sermon for them. That's my job. That's what I'm doing, is writing a sermon for them. And so then that's something that they want. Ideally, that's something they want to hear and find value in, that we're connecting in that way.
Yeah, I've heard, I think it was in a Haddon Robinson book or one of those guys. He writes about in his, when he comes to kind of the application part of his sermon, as he's sitting at his desk, writing it out, he says that he has some like imaginary people that he invites them to sit next to him, and he kind of thinks, okay, what about for the plumber? What about for the academic? What about for the cancer survivor? What does these people need to hear? And are you doing something similar to that, but it's actually real people? Are you thinking about Susan and Tom and Christopher?
Yeah, I mean, I would take it probably a step further and say, Monday, Tuesday, if my week works and flows, Monday, Tuesday, I'm in the text, kind of sorting out, what does this text say? What am I going to, and what's the main points and that sort of thing. But then Wednesday, Thursday, not just abstractly the plumber, whoever, but Wednesday, I'm sitting next to a hospital bed, holding someone's hand, praying with them and listening to their story. And then I'm having lunch with someone who's telling me what's going on in their life and encouraging and praying with them. And, that's how I'm spending Wednesday, Thursday as the sermon's forming in my mind. And so now it's a sermon written for these people. What do they need to hear in this moment? What's going on in their lives? And the sermon is, that's I guess in my mind, what I mean by a pastoral sermon or pastoral preaching. It's a sermon now from the text, but directly to these people in what's going on right now in their lives, and being kind of shaped and molded for them in that way.
Yeah. And I think there's a way of doing that doesn't start in the text, but that starts with the person. And it's, it's like, well, the sermon today is about how, wives just need to respect their husbands, and it's based on this interaction that I had, and she really needs to hear this. And that's maybe going about it backwards, right?
Yeah, that's unhealthy. And there's a danger there because, especially, again, I have a church of 80 people. So if I target a sermon like that, everybody knows who I'm, who I've been spending time with and what's going on. And then that person feels called out and isolated and so on.
Yeah.
So that would be an unhealthy way, or an unhealthy application of what I'm kind of saying.
Yes. And continuing our 3-part series on disobedient kids in the youth group.
Yes, of whom there are 5 kids and 1 is disobedient.
Yeah.
And we all know.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So So preaching is a pastoral act. It's a text-based, but declaration or expression of care and love to an actual congregation.
Yeah. And I can give you maybe an example, even from my sermon just 2 days ago, where I was preaching in the Gospel of Mark on the rich man who comes to Jesus. What must I do to inherit eternal life? And just says, sell all your possessions, give to the poor, come follow me. And he goes away sad. And then Peter, after he just says it's impossible, it's harder than for a rich man to enter the kingdom than a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Disciples ask, who then can be saved? And then Peter says, see, we have left everything to follow you. And then Jesus gives the affirmation, there's no one who has not left all these things who will not receive 100-fold as much. And so in that text, as I'm studying it, there's 2 messages there. There's the message to the rich man, sell all you have, come follow me, and it's hard, and he goes away sad. There's a message to Peter, we have left everything to follow you. And there's maybe some insecurity there or whatever. And Jesus is reassuring him that it was worth it. So now in my congregation, as I'm preparing that message, the previous week I preached on the cost of discipleship. And I had a few people say to me in one way or another, man, that was a heavy sermon on what we need to sacrifice and give up to follow Christ. And what about God's grace? What about God's grace to us when we're struggling? And isn't there a message that isn't just telling us that we've never done enough and we've never given up enough? And so now as I'm looking at the story of the rich man, well, I've got to preach both sides of it. Yeah, there's a message here of you need to give up everything. there's also a message of reassurance. And so maybe my congregation needs to hear that message of reassurance. And maybe I need to make sure that really comes out in the message this week in my context for these people, and not get too caught up in the rich man and the call to sell everything and come follow me, even though I'm going to preach that too. But if it weren't for my congregation give me that feedback and interaction, I might have kind of let fall away what Jesus' interaction with Peter and the reassurance at the end. And I'm pretty sure I've preached that passage before and not brought out that reassurance to Peter at the end. But my congregation, those pastoral interactions, help me to see what my congregation needs me to bring out of the text this week.
Yeah. Well, thanks for highlighting that. And, the way that, I don't know, the podcast industry works, or the way that YouTube works is, the people we tend to listen to tend to be, conference speakers, or the ones who do the circuit, and they're speaking, they're addressing often an unknown crowd. And they're really ought to be a model of the hyper local pastor, because that's, at the end of the day, that's all we have is local pastors. And some people kind of make a name for themselves by maybe addressing all the local pastors at once. And so we're like, oh, you're great. But it's I love the D.A. Carson autobiography of the Memoirs of an Ordinary Pastor. Kind of this really just great, humble biography of his dad. And he just looked after a congregation in French-speaking Canada and dies. That's it, and he cares for them. And I just love the way that, Don Carson just kind of honors his dad. And the phrase Memoirs of an Ordinary Pastor just has stuck with me for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of, I guess, that kind of model is what I'm thinking about. It's kind of antithetical to me in my day job as a pastor when, like, writing a book or something like that. And then publishers, where's your social media account? Where's your platform? Where are you building this invisible audiences? Like that's just completely the opposite of everything that I value and do on a daily basis, even though there's value to those things.
Yeah.
It's the opposite of pastoring, and it's not the way I think of pastoring and preaching in a local church context.
We're building a platform right now, Adam. You're on a podcast right now.
Oh, great.
Yeah. And listen, both of the hearers of this podcast are going to love it.
Yeah. Well, it's the irony of like a Eugene Peterson who writes about all he wanted to do was be a pastor of a congregation, and not too large a congregation and all those things. And then next thing you know, he's selling millions of books, and he's famous, and everybody wants to know what he has to say about pastoring and not being famous.
Yeah. Well, this kind of to pivot. So you talk about like pastoring and caring for people. And then I know about that because like one of the stories that you've told in one of the sermons that I listened to, you speak about, I guess, in a previous congregation, kind of an older couple that you thought really modeled like Christian character and Christian growth and respect for one another. But their adult children informed you that when they were younger, that was totally missing, and that they've had like a real change in their heart that turned into a change in their life, which turned into kind of gracious interactions with each other. So that was a story that you told that was very like pastoral and also very, very encouraging. And it stuck with me when I heard it. But so that's that on the one hand, that's kind of the result, and then also maybe part of that kind of pastoral preaching. Like you're preaching by giving an example, not of people in that very congregation, but like people like them, and saying this is kind of like what maturity can look like and growth.
Yeah, kind of trying to set out for people, a vision of what is this text saying. And I forget what sermon I used that story in. Maybe it was about forgiveness or reconciliation, or
it was one of the ends of Colossians, kind of one of the vice lists or virtue lists in Colossians.
Yeah, somewhere in there. Trying to help people, like boots on the ground type stuff, right? So not just describe abstractly what does it mean to grow in kindness or patience or forgiveness, but helping paint a picture what is actually going to look like in your life, and kind of charting or giving a story to help people envision themselves growing in those ways.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of, it really bridges both of these things, because I'd like to ask you next about like the role that you've come to find, or that you believe that stories have in our sermons as a way of like connecting with people from different cultures or even different educational backgrounds. Like, why should we be telling stories in the first place?
Yeah, this is something that I'm increasingly learning. I don't know that I've figured it out or I'm that good at it, but it was interesting for me to come. So I took a break from ministry, did a PhD, came back into pastoral ministry and preaching. And very quickly I realized my preaching sounds a little too much like my dissertation. And this is not working for my congregation. Maybe there's a congregation out there it would work for. I don't think there's any congregation that would have appreciated that preaching. But then the more I got to know my congregation in the place where I'm at, the more I realized that abstract, theoretical type speaking doesn't connect very well. It connects with some people, but not a lot of people in my congregation and context. I'm in a small town. It's a rural town. It's a migrant farm town. We're in Washington State. It's one of the poorest and least educated towns in Washington State. So in the town, demographically, something like 40%. Let me make sure I get this right. Only 40% of adults have a high school diploma in town.
Oh, okay.
So there's a cultural, there's an educational gap. There's a cultural gap. We have people in our congregation. We have some people in our congregation who are medical doctors, who are highly trained professionals, who would love to hear or could at least follow abstract, rational type preaching. But then we have people in our church who haven't read a book for 20 years. Mm-hmm. They're unfamiliar with the Bible. They maybe made it through high school, but barely. They've not done any post-high school education. They haven't been in the classroom for 30 years. So now I'm supposed to stand up and preach and communicate across the gamut. And plus we've got kids in the room, old people in the room, people hearing their 1,000th sermon, people hearing their second sermon in their life. So storytelling, I've come to realize, and other people have helped me realize, transcends all these boundaries. When I tell a story like about the couple you mentioned, everybody in the room is engaged and listening and interested in hearing about this couple. If I just speak abstractly and define forgiveness and therefore this and therefore that, if I make any more, this I try to remember, if I make more than one logical inference because of this, therefore that, and then if I make a second and therefore this, I've lost half the room. I've gone too abstract, too theoretical. That's good academic writing. It's terrible preaching in my context with my people. So better to do what's a little bit harder for me, at least, do the hard work of figuring out some kind of story I can tell that will make that point, rather than just lecturing through that point and watching the room disengage as I do. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's part of what coming to realize about the value of those stories.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And two logical inferences in a row, like, oh, you got me. You got me. Because that's how much of that's how some of the New Testament is written. Logical inference after logical inference,
Yep.
And, again, like as I'm currently a student and, like this is just how things work, but that's not how everyone thinks. And they're not bad for not thinking that way. It's just a different way of thinking because part of the New Testament is written that way, but the other part of the New Testament isn't like that at all. So,
right now I'm preaching through the Gospel of Mark a little bit leading up to Easter, the stories, all that. It's great preaching because the text is a story. Mm-hmm. And then my elder board has been talking with me, maybe we should do a series in the book of Romans. Mm-hmm. And then I'm thinking, oh my goodness, how on earth?
Yeah.
I mean, book of Romans is nothing but logical inferences and layers and layers of it. So if I go down that path, that's where the real challenge will come. Can I do this in a way that doesn't disenfranchise half the congregation? But it's also in their Bible too, and they need to be doing that hard work of trying to figure out how to read some of that and think through it.
Yes, yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, the same, the church that I pastor, like we're next to a university. So we have we have medical students, we have lecturers, we have, the intelligentsia. And we're also in a city that is, full of alcoholism and, unemployed, like alcoholic addicted, and they all come to well, they don't all, and people from both of those sections, like are, I inflict my sermons upon them both, and some people are just, tracking the logical inferences. And so this is a great reminder to myself to do this. So thank you. So in speaking about like a good story to include, like what is a good story? What's a good story that fits a sermon? Or maybe even if you can think back to a couple of days ago, like, was there a story that you told there that you thought worked really well? Or do you have ideas or principles about what kind of stories we should be telling?
Yeah, well, this is where I'm in the learning boat too, and come back in a couple decades and we'll see what I figured out. But I think for me, in my congregation, again, this is my congregation. It's less stories that people are not familiar with. Like let's tell a historical story about George Washington crossing the Delaware. Well, some people don't know that story. Or I'm assuming people know something that maybe I shouldn't assume, but more of the personal stories. So a lot of my stories are like the one that you picked up on, and it actually is encouraging to me that you remembered something from a sermon, and it happens to be the story, which is part of how that works, but of a couple and of their life, and something that people can relate and connect to in that way. I told a story maybe a couple months ago now. We had a youth retreat, and there was one of the counselors that we had up there at this youth retreat shared her testimony. And as she shared her personal testimony with the kids, she had every kid in the room just on the edge of their seat, absorbing that. And what was interesting was, as part of her testimony, she actually talked about how she heard somebody else give their testimony. And as this person was giving their testimony, she was thinking, this person's telling the story of my life. And then it made her want to give her life to Christ. And this is part of how she came to Christ. Well, so she's telling this testimony at Snow Camp. Well, then I took up that story, her story, and used it in a sermon a few weeks later, because I knew that some of the kids who were there would remember her telling the story, and the adults might appreciate it, and used her story. We're talking about God's redemption, and used her story as an illustration of how God takes up our brokenness and comes alongside of us in our story and redeems us. And so I used that story kind of to open that sermon. And what was interesting was, this is partially my context too, as I was wrapping up the sermon, there was one lady in our congregation who likes to every now and then raise her hand and try to ask a question during the sermon. She hasn't quite figured out that like sermons are not the place for questions. It's like a monologue, not a dialogue. But anyway, so I kind of ignored it. And then as I was sitting down and as the music team's coming up, music, whatever, she said, "You never finished that story. What happened with that young lady?" And so then gave me a chance afterward to talk to her and say, well, her story's not finished. That's why there's more to what God's doing in her life with redemption and so on. But of the whole sermon, this beautiful sermon I preached, she was mostly engaged with that story of that person. And so there's something about a personal story where people can relate and kind of see themselves in that story that makes some kind of connection there.
Yeah. All right. So you talk about personal stories. I mean, and then that most recent example was actually, that wasn't your story. You were recounting the story of someone else.
Someone else, yeah.
Telling their story. So in our Expositors Collective Facebook community, we have a private group, and we kind of geek out about preaching and teaching. And when I told them that I'd be speaking to you and asking you about stories, there's been, I've checked it now, I think there's 19 people who've commented, and most of them said the same thing. That I'm going to read Kevin Barron. He says, "I use my life as an illustration, often pointing out where I failed and how God has brought redemption out of that." And then many people use the phrase, don't make yourself the hero of the story. What are your thoughts on what role does ourself and the good things that we do, what role does that play in our sermons or in the illustrations that we use?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of any specific examples. I don't use myself as a story very often, I guess. maybe I should more. I would agree with those commenters. I rarely will I make myself the hero of the story. And in fact, even if it's a story where maybe I am the hero, I'll often flip the story and tell it the opposite way.
Yeah.
I once knew a person who
went to the third heaven.
Something like that. Yeah. Who could that be?
Yeah.
And also, and maybe this is so obvious as need to be said, but I rarely use my kids in a story, even if it's a good or bad thing. I just don't want them to feel like the sermon they're in the spotlight just because their dad's up there preaching. So my kids pretty much never end up in a sermon. My wife maybe on occasion, but again, only if I'm going to be saying something positive and affirming about her weaknesses, or she's open about them, but those are for her to tell, not for me to tell, especially not the pulpit.
Yeah. Someone says this: as a pastor's kid, I highly encourage asking permission of your children before you use an experience with them as a sermon illustration. Your life with them is not sermon fodder. It's precious and valuable. Someone also added.
Yeah. And I've done that a couple times. And then I kind of realized, and maybe I take this too far, but I kind of realized, they're too young to even know the implications of saying yes. And so they might feel like they're okay with it. And then later on realize, well, wait, now everybody knows that and they keep bringing it up. And so I've been even reluctant to ask them permission. I've just kind of made that decision for them as well.
Wow. Yeah. Well, and I would think too, like, with my kids or, even my home life, that's like the easiest thing in the world for me to think of stories and illustrations from that. And I think, it's worth putting a little bit more work into thinking of an example or an illustration or a story from my life or whatever that goes beyond just, oh, this happened around the dinner table last night, because it's easy. And I was actually doing I do sermon reviews for people, and somebody pretty consistently, is always telling stories about a certain formative chunk of his life. This person always is referring back to, this era of his life. And it's almost guaranteed every single sermon is going to have a story from this time period. And I challenged him. I said, hey, listen, I know that was a really important time of your life. It's really, like I said, formative, but I want to challenge you to go broader, to talk about Napoleon or find out an interesting fact about this, or, but like, do people the favor of leaving your world and going into their world to finding something that will grab their attention beyond just autobiographical glimpses into your life. So I think there is a role for personal stories. I think you're making quite a good case of that, but maybe expanding and not just going with whatever is the easiest or the quickest or the most, the first thing that comes to your mind. Maybe think a little bit deeper, the second or third thing that comes to mind.
Yes, preaching can become, this probably isn't the best way to say it, but it can become like an exercise in narcissism. Like, I'm trying to work through these things in my life, and then the pulpit becomes like the outflow of what I'm trying to work through in my life. And that's not helpful. In fact, so a couple more things. One thing that I try to do is remove the first person from my preaching as much as possible. So anywhere I can take out I, me, I think, I thought, this happened to me, like those types of filler words, get them out and get myself out of the sermon. That's one part of it. But then also, when I tell a story, I edit. So I manuscript my sermons, and this is part of why I want to edit out anything in that story that's just filler, any part of that story that's not making the point that I want the story to make. And so I've heard people, and I've done this too, they'll tell a story, but they'll have a 2-paragraph lead into it that's all about me. When that lead in doesn't need to be there, just tell the story. So that's kind of, getting myself out of the sermon, editing that out. So that's kind of a discipline, I guess. And again, one of the things I'm still learning. You can listen to my sermons and find where I violated everything I'm talking about. These are things I'm learning, but that's part of it.
Yeah. Okay. That's definitely, food for thought and worth it. Yeah. Cause I can think of people, like, hey, listen guys, here's something you should know about me. I don't like snakes. Blah, 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 blah. Now here's a story, it's like, just tell the story and it'll become evident that you don't like snakes. That's a very good, because, time is precious. Attention is precious. And a story instantly grabs people's attention. The moment that you say, let me tell you a story, it gets everyone's engaged and you have them for a few moments. But to make that as purposeful and punchy and to the point, that's a valuable, you don't want to dilute it by all these extra paragraphs added in.
Yeah, and the goal is for people in my congregation, here's probably the only 40 minutes, 30 minutes of your week where you're going to sit silent and be reflective. And so this is a chance to be reflective on God's word and on your life and putting those pieces together, not a time to be reflective on the pastor and the pastor's life. Even though my life may contribute something to the sermon or may have a place somewhere in your reflection, but it's not, we can get to know each other over lunch. You can come over to my house and we'll have dinner. Then you can get to know me. But the sermon's a little different context. This, again, my opinion, not the place for it. Yeah.
And this is your episode, so you get to give your opinions.
There you go.
All right. So, hey, this is a really brief question. I want to talk to you in a moment about how you're currently trying to improve, but I think it would be a wasted opportunity to be speaking to an actual commentary writer without asking about what role do you think commentaries should play in the life of a preacher. So again, as I mentioned, you've contributed, or you're the co-author of the Colossians and Philemon commentary and the Kirux commentary series from our friends at Kriegel Academic. So how should people use that if they're preaching through Colossians?
Yeah, that commentary in particular you're asking about, or just commentaries in general?
Let's just say commentaries in general, but want to give a shout out to Kriegel Academic. And so I forced that in there.
Yeah. Well, commentaries are, of course, a really helpful tool. I've got countless commentaries on my shelves. I use them, I don't want to say daily, but I use them weekly. They help me at least get my mind around the text that I'm going to be preaching. Yeah. And especially if there's something in there that's confusing, if there's historical background type information. As a pastor preaching weekly, I don't have time to go track down journal articles. I don't have time to go track down original sources, do all that. I need somebody to have kind of curated all that information and distilled it down to here's the important pieces that you need to understand this text, whether it's the Greek background here, historical background there, cultural thing there. And so I'm always looking for, I don't want to read a bunch of commentaries. I want a couple commentaries that really do a good job of getting me the information I need to get my mind around the text. So then I can do my part, which is my congregation. How am I going to preach this for my congregation? So the K-Rook series, the one that I wrote, is kind of unique in that it has a co-author model. And so one author, in this case myself, writes up the exegetical part, kind of curating that material and what is it that you might need to know to get your mind around the text. And then there's a second author who writes sections on just some ideas for how you might think about preaching the text, which, in fairness to my co-author, that's the easiest part to criticize because we're all in different local contexts. And so
sure.
The things he's kind of suggesting may or may not be as helpful here or there in different contexts, but at least it's some ideas for what to do with the preaching side of it.
Yeah, well, I used it myself and the elders. We taught through Colossians, and that was the kind of one of our shared commentary series. And so I endorse it. Okay.
Well, now, thank you.
Quickly, moving on to the last question. I always kind of end with this question. So you've been preaching for quite a while, since 13 or since 23, we'll say. How are you trying to improve? What are your kind of goals for your next decade or so of preaching?
That would be a good thing for me to think through, goals for the next decade or so. Probably the primary thing I find myself working on, for me in my case, is clarity. How can I always be more clear? And again, in that pastoral context for my congregation. Mm-hmm. And so I've had, I realized, we talked a little bit about just kind of literacy in general, but I realized We have a lot of biblical illiteracy in our congregation. Somebody shows up for the first time, they don't have Sunday school background, they don't know the Bible. And so I've done things like I have a couple of congregation members who give me feedback on my sermons. I've asked them for particular feedback.
Yeah.
Tell me anytime that I have assumed somebody in the room knows something about the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm going to just say, well, you all know the story of Abraham, well, maybe somebody doesn't. And I certainly don't want to frame it like everyone knows this. But so then I've got to be aware before I bring Abraham into the sermon, I need to be prepared to actually explain who Abraham is. And if I don't have the time or the desire to do that, then maybe I shouldn't bring Abraham into the sermon. So I have some people giving me that kind of very particular feedback who are listening through the lens of those people who we know in our congregation. They know them, who are sitting here, who this is all brand new. Where are they getting lost? Where are they getting tripped up? Where have I done something that's not been clear for them? So that's one area. And then we're also I'm trying to find ways to break out the sermon. So it's not just a long monologue, but to take parts of it and incorporate into different parts of the service with children's messages and with in a closing prayer and maybe a few comments in the closing prayer, and so that it's not as long a one monologue with everything in it, but maybe break up some pieces. So some of those kinds of things I'm still working on.
Oh, would you consider answering those questions if someone raises their hand during the message?
Well, and sometimes no, in general, because I think there's value in the sermon being a monologue and being a reflective time. Yeah. And we do sometimes, and right now we're doing this, we'll have a Sunday school hour where we have sermon discussion as part of that. So we'll discuss the previous week's sermon, and I usually have some kind of preview of this is what we're going to be hearing in an hour. Okay. And so it's kind of a little more of a chance to process and preview what's coming in the sermon too. Yeah. But the sermon itself, I try to keep it, this is monologue, this is reflective, don't want too much interaction. And usually their question is something that I knew that question could come up. I chose not to include in the sermon for a reason, good or bad. So I don't want to get derailed by it now.
I just wanted to throw that one at you.
Yeah.
I think I could predict the answer, but I wanted to see you squirm.
And I do squirm when somebody puts their hand up.
Yeah. Well, in our like emailing back and forth before this, like you were mentioning that like one of the things that you've kind of pivoted or shifted into or had, that notion of like, not every sermon needs to be great. Do you want to unpack that a little bit as we close?
Sure. This has been a really important thing for me to learn. So if you go back to when I was pastoring that first church for a few years, thrown into the deep end, 23 years old, preaching every week. One of the gifts of those few years, there was another pastor who was between churches. He was about 55 years old or so at the time, been pastoring for 30 years between churches. So he was just sitting in our congregation on Sundays and watching my ministry, which was an amazing gift. And so one of our times when we met together, had breakfast, he said to me, Adam, I think what you really need to learn is you need to learn how to preach a B sermon. Okay. You always want to get an A. Yeah. And you need to learn to be content with a B. You need to learn to be content with a mediocre sermon. That I was even offended at the time. I don't know. I did not understand what he was trying to say. I knew I needed to understand it because I respected him. But that went against everything in my blood. I'd always been an A student, always done my best work. I value preaching. I put all my time into it. And what he was saying is what has, over the last 15 or 20 years since then, has turned into this idea of what we talk about pastoral type preaching. Like what he was saying was, you're getting everything from those commentaries into that sermon. You're packing it full. You've got all the information there, and you're neglecting the congregation, and you're not connecting with your congregation. And there'd be value in scaling back the study and engaging in people's lives, and then preaching a sermon that's not quite as perfect, but that actually connects with people, which in a roundabout way is actually a better sermon. But in the way he framed it, be content with a B sermon. And I've seen that play out a lot of times since then that he was right. He was absolutely right. That was something I needed to learn to be content with. And so sometimes people get this idea, you're a PhD, your sermons must just be loaded with academic material and the most intellectual sermon. No, I mean, I hope not. That would be very poor preaching and very poor pastoring. That's not the goal. I don't know how much time we have. I can give you another example of when I saw this play out, when this really was driven home to me. It was just a couple of years ago. So I'd heard that from this pastor 15 years ago, maybe 18 years ago now. Been processing it all this time. And then a few years ago, my family and I visited another church for a Christmas Eve service. And this is a church, we know some of the people in this church. I know the pastor very well, I've known him and respected him for many years. And in this Christmas Eve service, he preached probably a 20-minute message. And as he was preaching, I thought, and I've heard him preach a lot of times, I thought this is one of the poorest messages this guy has ever preached. I could tell I know him. He's been overwhelmed pastorally. He just is pulling something out of a file and he's trying to get through this message, and it's just really rough.
An old classic.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
And he's kind of winging it a little bit. Service is over, and some friends of ours who were in that church, members of that church, and longtime members of this pastor's been there 25 years, and they're members of this church. This friend of ours turned around and said, "Wasn't that the best Christmas Eve sermon you've ever heard?" And I thought, no, that was one of the worst I've ever heard.
Yeah.
But as I reflect on that, this is somebody who has had a personal relationship with this pastor for 25 years, been hearing him preach for 25 years, been mentored by him. They've family funerals, weddings, life events. Like, this pastor's been there with them. And so because this pastor has been a shepherd to them, I'm not advocating mediocre preaching, but because this pastor has been a shepherd, they're hearing him preach. They're not hearing the sermon so much, and they're willing to overlook all these faults and flaws because of who he's been as their pastor and shepherd for all of these years. So he preached a D sermon that Christmas Eve, and his people heard an A. You put that sermon on YouTube and it would get thumbs downs all around. Not a good public sermon, but for his people and the shepherding, and in that moment, the sermon worked for them. And I'm sure he went home and said, "Oh man, I've got to do better next time. That was not my best effort, but Lord, take it and redeem it, because it's the best I had that day."
And it seems like that's exactly what the Lord did. Yeah.
Not in my heart. I was too judgmental.
Yeah. Good point.
Oh man, this isn't very good. But for his people, he was preaching. That sermon was singing right to their hearts. And they were hearing it.
I wonder if he's going to listen to this podcast and be like, "Wait a second, Adam visited my church on Christmas Eve."
Yeah, he just threw me under the bus. No, I know. I trust if you listen to this podcast, you say, "Yeah, that's exactly what happened that Christmas Eve." And I wish Adam would have just forgotten it, but maybe it could be helpful for someone else out there.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we had a previous guest, David Downs, and he's in, I think, Palermo, Italy, or he's somewhere in Italy. But he just used a phrase, paper time and people time. And he said that he tries to divide his week into time with books and then time with parishioners. And not even necessarily members of his church, but even just like people in the community. So he's an American who moved to Italy. So he realizes he's at some kind of, to some degree, cultural disadvantage of just not, so he intentionally spends time just talking to people in evangelism, and then also just in discipleship, and then just socially engaging with people. And he said, I need to do that just as much as I need to read the latest commentaries or fine tune the sermon. So yeah, people time and paper time. And that kind of has stuck with me.
Yeah, and I've known a couple people who I would never give them the advice, "Hey, preach mediocre sermons," because I'd probably give them the advice, step up the paper time in that language.
Mm-hmm.
You need to learn to do some more study and draw more out of the text and go a little deeper in the text and those things. I've known a couple people like that, but for me, it was the opposite. And probably for a lot of us, we come out of seminary where we've learned all the paper skills. We spend all that time in the library, and then we need to get out of the office and go spend some time with the people.
Yeah. Well, Adam, hey, we're actually going like we've gone overtime. This is I've enjoyed every moment of this. I've happily gone overtime. Hopefully, it's okay with your schedule too. Hope you don't mind.
Oh yeah.
But this has been really great. I'm going to say like, hey, where can people follow you on social media? I think the answer is they can't, right? Because you're not engaged in there, right?
Not really. I mean, our church, we do post the sermons.
Yeah.
And I think that's on Spotify. Maybe somebody else does that. I have a Facebook account I check about once a month and then don't do anything with. So,
well, I'll put the link to the church's stuff in the show notes. And are there any like writing projects you're working on or something we can look forward to in the future?
I've done a couple self-published things, and then I've got some different ideas, but nothing under contract or anything. Right now, my church needs me a little more than the writing does. So, but I hope to get back to some more writing projects.
That's very pastoral of you.
Well, thanks. Yeah.
All right.
Well, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you for having me.
I mean, you've kind of encouraged us hopefully and telling more or better stories, and just towards pastoral care, and that maybe is actually even better or just as important as our well-developed sermons. So they connect with the sermons and make for better developed sermons. That's just my experience. Very good. Thank you so much. All right. Well, for the listeners, I hope that this episode and all that we do at the Expositors Collective helps you to grow in your personal study and your public proclamation of God's Word. Thanks, Adam. Yep. Thank you. Well, thanks for listening all the way to the end. Make sure that you check out our show notes. There's further biographical information about Adam and his life and his ministry. There'll be links to the sermon stream, the Spotify playlist from his own church. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is going to be kind of a follow-on interview that's going to be coming in the next few weeks where I speak with Dr. Jeffrey Arthur, who co-authored the K. Rook's commentary on Colossians and Philemon. And if you've enjoyed this one, I guarantee that you're going to want to subscribe so that future episodes come automatically to your device. In the meantime, I hope that this episode helps you to grow in your personal study and your public proclamation of God's Word. I'll catch you next Tuesday.